Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. Sarah Bedford is inside the Beltway, where she works with the Washington Examiner as their investigations editor. Sarah has been gone for a while on maternity leave. She's back. Sarah, welcome. Great to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Now, Sarah, today is a great day to come back because there's some investigating to do about Politico. How are you going to go about that? Because we have friends, right? You and I have friends at Politico. And I hate to take the axe to them, but my goodness, $35 million from the federal government is the high number, $8 million is the low. What are you going to do with that?
Yeah, it's like the federal workers couldn't share passwords for these subscriptions. Millions of dollars had to go to paying for this. I think, you can look at this and say it's a trade publication. Maybe some of this information helps people do their jobs, but it's also to the average person a sort of symbol of the excessive government spending that Doge and Republicans are now trying to crack down on. So even though in one sense, I can see why some of these government agencies subscribed to those trade publications. It's obviously something that the American people were voting against when they sided with Donald Trump and Republicans.
It is to me, Sarah, deep insiderism. Now, I live in the Beltway most of the year, and I am subject to insiderism as well. They call it GOPE, but I get out in the winter to California to teach, and I go to Maine in the summer. I try and spend, at least 5 months out of the year outside of the Beltway, so I'm not absorbed in the cocoon that is the Beltway. This is a money recycling business. The federal government gets money from Congress. They give it to Politico. Politico covers the agencies that buy the subscriptions that then go to Congress and say, spend more money. And Congress, to your knowledge, I shouldn't presume facts not in evidence. To your knowledge, is there a line item in the USAID budget that directs them to spend money on Politico?
To my knowledge, no, that's not something that Congress appropriated, but obviously USAID was spending the money on this sort of thing. But just the tiny peek we've gotten under the curtain of USAID and some of these other agencies has shown this sort of, like you mentioned, information loop that taxpayer dollars was going to fund that benefited the left. You also have censorship organizations that were receiving State Department money and USAID money that were sort of reinforcing the narratives that publications like Politico would put out there. And that's a sort of really stunning thing that I don't think a lot of people were really aware of before we started getting this peek behind the curtain because of Doge and these other efforts.
Your boss, like me, have been doing this a long time, Hugo. Have you asked Hugo yet whether the Examiner's gotten any grants or money subscriptions from from the AID? Because John Podhoretz from Commentary said we people on the right have been kind of stupid about this. We didn't even ask for any.
That's right. We should have been marketing ourselves to the federal government. I know that the Washington Examiner at one point was blacklisted by some of these censorship organizations that were receiving taxpayer dollars through USAID and other agencies. So, everyone is sort of in DC is caught up in this sort of information loop that's been funded by our taxpayer dollars.
Well, I want to distinguish for people sources versus paid access. I spend years developing relationships with, say, someone like John Thune, so that if I need the majority leader at some time in the next 2 weeks, I can book him if I really need him, and sometimes he will call and ask for an interview. That's a relationship with an influential source. I have the same with Leader McConnell. I've got the same with Donald Trump. I'm sure you do as well. I have no objection to that. That's journalism, but we don't pay for it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of shocking how the sheer volume of money that was going towards these subscriptions is staggering on paper, right? $35 million for subscriptions for reporters that are a lot of times professionally and even socially cozy with the very people that they're covering. That's the sort of thing that you see in political coverage, but also a less well understood aspect of that is it's also in policy coverage and trade publications. You see those sorts of incestuous relationships that American people are just like really fed up with right now. And the fact that so much money was spent on those media organizations and that they are in jeopardy just because the money was temporarily turned off for a couple of weeks is not something I think that was well understood before all this.
I want to come back and talk to you about trade publications. That's not Politico. trade publications are BNA, environmental reporter, which I used to get when I was practicing law, and trade publications are the federal. I mean, there are trade publications that you get to get into the weeds, but they're not this. And Sarah Bedford is the perfect person to talk about it. You can follow her, by the way, on X at Sarah C. Bedford. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh. It's Sarah Bedford, investigations editor at the Washington Examiner, joins me. You can follow her at Sarah C. Bedford on X. Sarah, when we went to break, I was talking about the Beltway-Legacy Media Complex. And everyone knows I've been in this game since 1990, most of the time on the West Coast, 8 to 10 years in the Beltway doing this. And before that, I was in the Beltway. You've been doing this a while, too. So let's put your cards on the table. How long have you been a reporter covering the Beltway?
Oh, gosh, about 10 years now.
Okay,
wow,
so
that dates me.
45 years between us. So we're not throwing stones from a glass house. We try to develop sources. But there's a hierarchy. First of all, there's papers that come out every day. Now they become platforms that come out every day with reporters at the top of their game that develop sources. The Examiner is one of those. There are radio shows like mine that are every day. There's television shows that are every day like Fox News, Special Report. But then there are trade publications. Would you explain what those are?
Well, trade publications are typically focused on specific industries and breaking news within those agencies. Like, for example, if you're a real estate agent, there are trade publications that cover, in a really niche way, just what's going on in the real estate market. And so, defenders of these Politico contracts would say that these are trade publications just focused on the business of legislating and regulatory policymaking. Obviously, this is sort of a self-perpetuating part of the Washington machine that's really unpopular right now, and it's an enormous expense of taxpayer money to get information that isn't necessarily that hard to dig up. Like you say, a lot of it is just counting votes, not developing sources the way other media outlets do.
And the more traditional trade publication, I mentioned BNA, which has done it for a long time, Inside EPA. There are some publications, and there are people that cover, God bless them, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. When I was at first a young summer lawyer working for Baker and Botts, I had to go to FERC hearings as an associate, as a summer associate. God awful. But when FERC makes a decision, it impacts lots of companies with pipelines and gas and oil. Someone's got to be in the hearing room. They got to write up what FERC did today. That's not going to sell a newspaper, right? Have you ever been to a FERC hearing, Sarah?
No, and I don't really care to.
No, you don't want to go. I mean, people like it that do it, and lawyers get rich of it, but a trade publication was typically for people in the business. Politico was the first of what has become a forest of gossip sheets. There's Axios, there's Punchbowl, there's Politico, and there are others. There are newsletters from every old publication, probably the Examiner. Town Hall has one. Salem owns Town Hall. But we don't expect to be paid by the government. That's the difference. I mean, I'm just so shocked. Do you think anyone's not shocked?
I think there's a lot of DC insiders that have sort of defended this move, and even people in the journalism industry. It's the way that the industry has been moving. A lot of these non-trade publications, as you say, have been moving towards these subscription models because you just can't monetize traffic the same way you used to be able to. And so it's a more and more common move from these media companies. But like you mentioned, this isn't a sort of niche area where you have reporters covering, these things that no one else is covering. Politico often covers the same things that a lot of these other outlets are covering, and it's just a staggering amount of money to pay for coverage that, like you mentioned, does feel widely available. Though I will say the Politico Pro tool, which the assumption from a lot of journalists is that that's what was being paid for, does go more in depth on counting votes and regulations and stuff like that. But that is also, a lot of that is open source anyway.
But let me ask you about this. This is the real nut to crack. If you are getting that much money, whether it's the low end $8 million a year or the high end $35 million a year, and the agency that is providing you asks you not to cover something or to spike a story or to please distort a story, isn't the temptation to say yes once you become addicted to the money.
Right. Of course. I mean, that is the conflict at the center of all of this controversy over the payments, right? Although I will say that is the conflict at the center of, I think, of most political journalism, is that you have this problem of access. You need to enjoy that access to your sources in the White House, to your sources on Capitol Hill, to continue to have them talking to you and giving you scoops. But at the same time, you're charged as a journalist with holding those people accountable and covering what they're doing critically. You see a lot of that access peddling in the way that the Biden White House operated, right? Reporters didn't report for a long time on what was obviously going on because of, in large part, fear of reprisals from other journalists, but also from White House aides. And so, a lot of that is at the center of the concerns about a news organization receiving that much money from the federal government.
And then the last silo is ProPublica. Now, they've done some good work. I've had them on the program before. They've done some good work, but I don't know who funds them. And a lot of people think that ProPublica is funded by, let's just call it Soros World, which is a placeholder for everybody on the left that's got a lot of money and is doling it out. What do you think of ProPublica and whether or not we can trust their reporting?
Well, we've covered this at the Washington Examiner. ProPublica does take money from some left-wing sources and from some of those, dark money donor networks that fuel a lot of causes on the left. And critics would say that the ProPublica's coverage in recent years has reflected that. We've seen them report on, for example, allegations against conservative Supreme Court justices, and also a story that was pretty heavily criticized, and I think with good reason, about the abortion law, the effects of the abortion law in Georgia, and whether or not it was killing women because of the uncertainty with the new abortion ban there. So we have seen some really left-leaning ProPublica coverage, and it's funded by left-wing sources. So again, if you follow the money and you look at this critically, you can wonder whether funding shapes the coverage of these outlets that claim to be middle of the road and unbiased.
And not for profit and working in the public interest. I say hooey. If you can't tell me who's paying for it, if you don't have sponsors and you don't have advertising and subscription counts, somebody's buying it. And that smells bad. Hey, Sarah Bedford, it smells great. It smells great around the studio that you're back. We are so happy you are, and I am so glad you will be joining us weekly again. Welcome home. Great to have you on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Go and follow her on X at Sarah C. Bedford.